Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to this live stream. I'm delighted to be again with Bill Dembski speaking about intelligent design and his new book, The Design Inference. Second edition is 25 years in the making. So, how are you doing, William?
Doing well. Great to be back with you. It's, I think, been about 2 years.
It has, yes. We
Yeah.
last spoke during COVID,
Yeah.
and yeah, that was a different world.
Yeah.
So, just this month, I'm so excited, and this is something I highly recommend everyone buys. We have the second edition of the Design Inference. This is one of the landmark books which has changed the game in terms of discussions on design, not just contemporary discussions about creation and evolution. So, the first question I think a lot of people are going to be asking is, why is the second edition 25 years later when the first edition was selling like hotcakes?
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't, for a research monograph, it was selling like hotcakes, perhaps the first edition. But when we're talking, this is not New York Times bestseller material. I mean, it is a research monograph. But I think there are several things that were going on. One, I think these ideas required some time to mature. There were a number of areas where I think the original edition of the Design Inference, it scratched an itch, but it didn't really solve the problem. So I think it was on the right track. But for instance, one of the key notions, specified complexity, it was not presented as a unified information measure. So there was more progress to be done just in the way of research. And this second edition has a co-author who's a computer scientist, really a genius. And he took some of my work and extended it. So that's in there as well. But with that said, 25 years is a long time. So I think this book probably could have been done 15 years ago. But another thing that happened, I published it with Cambridge University Press. And at the time, the book is a method for design detection. It takes certain statistical ideas and extends them. But the book itself didn't get me into trouble with the mainstream academy because methods are methods. It was in continuity with standard statistical theory. And actually, it got well reviewed. Well, the endorsements were really great across the board from people on the ID side as well as secular academics. But very quickly, I started applying this method to biology. And that's what got me in hot water. So when that happened, I wanted to write a sequel to the Design Inference because the first edition, I only touched on biology very briefly on the origin of life. And I basically sketched, this is how this method of reasoning will work on the origin of life. And depending on how you fill in the premises, you might end up on the creationist side, you might end up on the materialistic side. But I was agnostic, or I gave the impression of agnosticism. I said, this is, this method of design detection works in this debate. But in the months after the Design Inference appeared, I published an anthology called Mere Creation, and that put my cards on the table. And so when I wanted to do a sequel applying this method of design detection to biology, a book that I was going to call No Free Lunch, Cambridge University Press, my editor there were two editors because this was a research monograph. There was the academic editor, Brian Skirms at UC Irvine, who was, basically a research monograph is like a journal article, except it's too long to fit into a journal. But then there was the business editor in New York City, and he was a good guy, but he leveled with me. He said, even if this sequel, and the Design Inference had done very well for them, but he said, even if this sequel passes approval on the academic side here, you should know that there are one or two biologists on the syndicate in Cambridge across the Atlantic, where I know you have been. Is that where you are still?
Yeah, that's where I'm based.
Yeah. So, so that's, he said, and they're probably going to deep six it, So at that point, I just had this sense that my publisher was no longer with me. And so, so it's not as though everything in this second edition is new. I have published pieces of it in various places. But the problem was, there was no place where I really collected all these ideas. So, if critics or people wanted to say, okay, well, what did you do about this? It's okay, here's an article, here's a typescript that's on my website.
Yeah.
And so without the publisher, and I'm sorry if I'm being long-winded, but without the publisher being behind it, I just always had this nagging sense. It needs a second edition, but they're not going to publish the second edition. It needs a second edition, but they're not going to publish it. So finally, on a lark, one might say divine providence, in 2020, I just said, I got to resolve this. So I found out who the relevant editor was at Cambridge University Press in New York City. Terrence Moore, the fellow who had told me, pulled back the curtain on the Cambridge Syndicate and told me, you're probably not going to have a good luck with the second edition or with a sequel here. He had passed away. So I tracked down the relevant parties and I said, I'd like the rights to the book back. And within a week, they gave me the rights back. I wonder if it was like, we don't want you here anymore. There's the door. So please, take the rights and be on your way. But once that happened, I just felt a freedom. I said, okay, now I can do what I want with this book. And so that's when I was really galvanized. And so that was, so then I started working on it, but then finally 2022, I really hit the ground running on it. I got some funding also and brought in this second author, and Winston Ewart. I mean, it's not that he's just out of the blue. I mean, I've collaborated with him since probably about 2009. We have a number of articles. He's a Google alum, PhD, extremely good programmer, but also good theoretical computer scientist. And so it really complements my expertise in probability and information theory. So that's maybe more history than you wanted, but that's
that's exactly, William, what I was prodding you for, because it's unheard of for your publisher to be giving back your rights. And also, the syndicate, in terms of the objection they were going to give here across the pond, they usually are supposed to just rubber stamp it and not put up objections. But clearly, right, when you wanted to apply the design inference to biology, this is when we started having all those issues. So one of the other things I wanted to mention is, in previous interviews, you've spoken about the atmosphere. In terms of the atmosphere changed after you, everybody, you were sort of the golden boy of, design and probability at one point. And then as soon as you indicated, well, we can apply this to biological information, we can actually apply this. And, here are my cards. There was a sort of a change in atmosphere for you personally. Can you get into that a little bit? Because I think a lot of people don't realize, it's not an objectively fair environment, academia at the moment.
Well, that's, and especially, I mean, if I read Chronicle of Higher Education and Inside Higher Ed daily, at least I get the emails, and it is so politicized. But even back 25 years ago, 23 years ago, it was clear that this issue was certainly politicized. So I think the mainstream secular academy, which is thoroughly materialistic, thoroughly Darwinist, they just hated this. And I think for a while they had to respond to it, but I think they just, I think finally just decided to say, it's discredited. We're just going to ignore this. Where I ran into perhaps more difficulty, and there's perhaps an irony in this, is when I was on the job market, just as design inference had been published, schools like Notre Dame and Princeton were looking at me. After that was done. But then I was looking at Baylor University was trying to hire me, and so I was actually hired. Baylor is a Baptist university, a Christian university. And so they hired me to do an intelligent design center. It was called the Michael Polanyi Center. And we had a conference with Steven Weinberg was there. It was all aspects of the title of the conference was The Nature of Nature. Is nature basically self-contained, or are there teleological powers, as it were, that can impact nature, and that are perhaps even beyond nature. So, but as what I didn't suspect was that there were a lot of faculty there that made their peace with Darwinism, saw that basically they were, I think this is my interpretation, it's there's always a danger of speculating about intent, but I saw patterns there, and it seemed that there was this move within the Christian world. I think there was an inferiority complex. Let's try to boogie with the best, with the Harvards and so on. And they just they didn't want this. This was a smirch as far as they were concerned for Baylor to associate itself with intelligent design. So we had this stellar conference. Simon Conway Morris was there. Christian DeDuve. Steven Weinberg. It was really a who's who of people on all sides of the issue. But within 3 or 4 days of that conference, they voted to shut the center down. And so, and then after that, the administration, rather than actually shut the center down, they set up a star chamber where they set up an independent review board, drawing people from outside, and then they did the work. So it's like Odysseus, or somebody, I won't kill you, and then you turn to your henchman, you kill him. So it's like, okay, so you can wash your hands of it. Well, anyway, so, and I don't, this is not a history I like to get into. I've moved past it, but I think it gives you a thumbnail of, even in the Christian world, Christian education. And it's a difference in the UK. I mean, we've got thousands of colleges, universities, private, public, but it was basically my mainstream academic career at that point was over. And then after Baylor, I was a contract worker there. I had the contract because I had been hired to do this center. I had no faculty affiliation, so I was not allowed to teach. It's kind of funny. I'm a faculty member. It's on my resume, that I was there for 6 years, and then people will ask me, what did you teach? Well, no, I never taught anything because they wouldn't let me, because it was too controversial to let me teach. And then actually I taught at Christian seminaries for about 6-7 years after that, to make ends meet. And that was interesting. It turned out I was too radical for the mainstream academy, and then I think finally I wasn't quite conservative enough for the seminary. So finally I left that and became a tech entrepreneur, and so that's what that's in a sense my day job. And then I still do a lot now. I do a lot on intelligent design. So. Yeah. So it's, but and my situation is not unique. I mean, the particulars are unique, but the sort of opposition, mean-spiritedness, just trying to discredit, invalidate these ideas, that's widespread. There was a film that you may be familiar with with a documentary with Ben Stein back in 2008 called No Intelligence Allowed. And I think that gives you a pretty good idea. I appeared in the film, but I was a little bit, I had been expelled too early. So I was there more as an information resource guy, but then the stories that they tell of people expelled, I could certainly appreciate what was going on there.
Absolutely. And, that was just the tip of the iceberg. There are a lot more instances where people don't come forward because they're still worried about their career. And speaking about, this documentary, there's another documentary on a BBC Horizon, and you referred to it in your book. And this particular part, I want you to read out for the audience, because BBC is, one of the most prestigious media outlets in the world. But this type of the type of editing that they did on this program is really some work. So one of the things that you write is, and this is in regards to your exchange with Richard Dawkins when you're speaking about specified complexity. But my part in the program had been edited so that it seemed my entire argument rested on improbability and did not include specification, right? And it's unbelievable that they did this type of editing, because if we look at your work in 1998, the design inference, and then your subsequent interviews and writings, is very clear what your argument was. It's
Right.
not like people at BBC did not understand. But can you just run us through this program and the way that they filmed it and what ended up? Yeah.
Well, this was early in my career, and so then you're trying to balance, is this an ambush? Are they going to try to edit this and make me look bad? But then again, I want to get some publicity for these ideas, and so that was the tension I was dealing with. And then, the fellow who was heading this up, I mean, he was very personable. This is, as I learned subsequently, this is what you do to sucker people in. You make it sound like, oh, we really want to treat you fairly and give you a chance. And so they interviewed me, but it was also kind of odd. I was, I'm in Waco, this Western cow town in some ways, and I love Waco, by the way. I lived there for about 12 years, and so there's much that I appreciate about it. But they had me walking on a railroad track, and then they had me in this little diner where I'm throwing dice, and they're interviewing me and asking me the questions. But the way they present it, though, it's as though I'm just talking about improbability. My case doesn't come across, and then it's Richard Dawkins is in that, but they present me as just, I don't know, kind of this this maverick who's in this Western town. There's from the BBC perspective, there's the East Coast, the West Coast, and then there's Middle America, and what good can come from that? This is where the barbarians, so I think inhabit. So they had me there, and then I know Mike Behe was there, his close colleague, and they put him on some sort of wasn't a Ferris wheel, it was some sort of amusement park, right, where his feet are dangling, and so it just puts us in this kind of ridiculous place. And then Richard Dawkins, he's behind some desk in a some sort of Don's office in Cambridge or Oxford or wherever, and then Ken Miller is being interviewed, and it's Ken Miller that they're putting me in opposition to. And so then Ken Miller is responding and makes this kind of simplistic probabilistic argument that any number of card hands that you deal out are going to be highly improbable, but still something's got to happen, and so that's how they juxtapose it. And so it seems like he's responding to me. And then subsequently, when I call him on it, he says, no, but I wasn't responding to you on that. I was responding to other people who make these simplistic arguments. But, by that time, the damage is done. And, the BBC program is out, and I'm seen looking like a fool.
Absolutely. And what's shocking is in the design inference, the explanatory filter is so widely, referred to in terms of these discussions. And it's surprising that the editors, and I'm sure they must have had some academics helping them, they could have just shown that and said, well, this is the formulation of the argument. And also, let's just look at the way the media treats, obviously, intelligent design proponents and their critics in a very different way. So Judge Jones, who has no training in the philosophy of science, once the Dover and Kitzmiller trial was over, he became a hero. He was celebrated as a public intellectual. I didn't know this until I saw one of your interviews that, his background was in something to do with liquor, some legal thing.
He presumably has worn various hats, but I think he was some sort of liquor control commissioner. And the thing is, I don't want to take anything away from him. That's people. Necessity forces us perhaps to do various things. But when I said that, I think I was still smarting from that trial, and I wasn't in a very generous mood toward him. But but that said, he's this is not his area. But I'm sure the ACLU was feeding him his lines. So it's that case there's a whole history with that, and that was really ill conceived.
Yeah. And so I think for the viewers, it's helpful to go back to something that you mentioned right in the beginning of the book, which is the need for both small probability and specification, right?
Right.
Specification here being a independently identifiable pattern. So this book's central claim, clearly articulated here and in the first edition, states that chance elimination requires both small probability and specification. So this is something that you keep reminding the readers of. Why is that point so central for you?
Well, I mean, it's just a fact of the matter. This is what we need in order to reliably infer design. So it's not enough to have brute improbability. Most things that happen in the world are highly improbable. If I have 1,000 marbles and I throw them on the floor, the precise arrangement of those marbles, they're many. I mean, it's the combinatorics is going to be huge. I mean, it's probably 10 to the 10,000 or so or more, just because of there's a two-dimensional geometry there. So it's but the thing is, if those marbles spell out, welcome to this program, or welcome to Wales or whatever, or the design inference, if it spells something out, then there's a pattern, and it's an independently given pattern. And we develop that. I mean, what do we mean by independently given pattern? We put that in computational terms, in terms of minimum description lengths. But that's what you need. You need that pattern in addition to improbability, and it's got to be the right sort of pattern, because we can always, the danger is always anything in some sense is patterned. But you can impose a pattern, as it were, on it, or is the pattern there in some objective sense intrinsically? And that's the sort of distinction that that specification is trying to get at. And it seems to me that it's getting at exactly what we do when we draw design inferences, and because I mean, design inferences, they're not uncommon. We do this all the time. We see, a murder investigation. If you're doing data fraud analysis, an archaeologist, is this an arrowhead? Is this a random chunk of rock? When we various illusions, we may see something that looks like an ink blot. Well, it could just, at first blush, it may just look like a random application of ink to paper. And then you see a pattern. It's a skull or a woman looking at herself in the mirror. And then you say, oh, wait a second. That's not random. There's design there. And there's an interesting asymmetry there. Randomness is always, as it were, a provisional category. It's because we haven't seen that objective pattern there that we regard it as random. But once we see the pattern, we don't unsee the pattern. Short of amnesia, we'll say, okay, that's non-random, and it won't revert to being random. So something that's random can become non-random if we see the pattern, but something that's non-random won't go back the other way. And so, yeah.
So this is a good segue to bring in your 1991 paper, Randomness by Design.
Right.
I think that's important for, this is obviously, it predates the design inference, but could you just go over the main sort of argument in that paper?
Yeah, because that, in a sense, that paper, Randomness by Design, got the ball rolling. And so I should perhaps give a little bit more history there. I was finishing my PhD in mathematics at University of Chicago in 1988. So I had defended, I had some time on my hands, and this was a dissertation in pure probability theory, so measure theory, standard sort of stuff. And then, so I had some time. There was a year on cryptography. Adi Shamir was at the University of Chicago, and so I sat in on some courses. So I had opportunity to delve into different things. And I had gotten to know Percy Diaconis at Stanford, who then he went to Harvard, and now he's back at Stanford. And I had written my dissertation on uniform probabilities. And what motivated that is I was also working with a physicist, Leo Kadanoff. And the idea was with these, this was at a time when there was a lot of ferment with chaos theory, nonlinear dynamics. Computers were just getting powerful enough so you could actually, represent some of these Julia sets and other things. And so I was the question I was asking was, well, what's the most random thing you could get? And it seemed to me that uniform probabilities, uniform random sampling was the best, and then randomness would try to approximate that. So anyway, that's a little backdrop. So I sent my dissertation to Percy Diaconis, and in consequence, he said, I'm doing a conference on randomness at Ohio State University.
Yeah.
And this was April of 1988. And he invited me to attend it. So I wasn't going to be a presenter, and it was an interdisciplinary conference. Amos Tversky was there in psychology. We had statisticians, computer scientists, and it was James Glick, who had written the book, the bestseller on chaos, covered it for the New York Times. But at the end of the conference, the conference ended on a thud, in the sense that we know what, and Percy Diaconis summarized it as we were all sitting around a circle, we know what randomness isn't, we don't know what it is. Yeah. And for me, I started mulling that over, and eventually I thought, that's exactly right. And, here we are as theistic believers, there's a sense in which randomness is not fundamental. It's the purposes, the mind of God is fundamental, and randomness has to be something downstream from that. And so I flipped the problem in this paper, and I said, it's not that randomness is fundamental. Randomness only makes sense in relation to design. So something is random as long as it breaks, as long as it doesn't match a set of designs. But once it does, then it's no longer random. So it's a formal definition of the idea, but it's a fecund idea. I mean, it's a fruitful idea, because then you can start asking, well, what are the patterns that we in practice we use to defeat randomness and infer design? So randomness by design, in that paper, design is not the full-orbed design as a causal power, but it's a mathematical notion, but it leads very naturally to this whole design inferential apparatus. And so I followed up that paper with another one, which I titled When Chance Precludes Chance, where the incipient ideas for the design inference were there. But I remember submitting that to another philosophy of science journal, Synthèse, and the chief editor, who was a big shot, I mean, he liked it. He said, there's a good paper in here, but it needs more work. Well, it did need more work. It needed to be fleshed out to the full design inference, and so that's where it went. So again, I sometimes feel I'm being long-winded and giving you more history than you want, but
no, actually, that's exactly what I'm trying to prod you for, because I think this history is important, and all of these things are leading up to where we are today. In the section of your book, The Metaphysics of Chance, I really love the way that you put it, that chance in its entirety could actually be a side effect of intelligence. So, right. From a materialistic perspective, we see, when I first came across you describing this idea, it was actually a big paradigm shift for me, because I'd accepted the materialistic perspective unassumingly, that we have to assume everything is random until proven otherwise. And when you invert it the way that you actually did, not only does it make sense from a theistic perspective, but also it just completely puts the onus of proof on them to prove randomness, which is actually very, very difficult. So, I mean, when you go into a bit more detail about these things, it's not long-winded at all. I think the history is very important. And there's another section that I really love, and this is the section that you've written on Thomas Reid and Hume. So I'm just going to highlight something just to prod your thoughts on this. So, operating within this Humean inductive framework, several critics of intelligent design have argued that the design inference cannot apply to any design outside of our direct experience. Human designers are therefore okay, extraterrestrial designers are iffy, and non-naturalistic designers are strictly prohibited. So I love the way that you explain the problem, the Humean inductive framework, and then answer it using Reid. Could you just go into that in a bit more detail?
Yeah, well, I enjoy Hume's Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. I've taught the book. But I think it's an interesting book in large part because the mistakes are so interesting. And so I think usually I think when people think of Hume as rebutting Paley, even though Paley comes after Hume, it's that Paley missed it because he's making an analogical argument, and any analogical argument, there's also disanalogy, and so Hume does push that any designer responsible for the world, he's looking more at the cosmos as a whole than biology, is going to be problematic, and that and he'll even talk about this designer being a bungler. But it seems to me the most important argument there, and this is ties in also with standard objections to intelligent design, that it's an argument from ignorance. Okay, that it's based on what we don't know, and I would say no, it's actually based on what we do know. But Hume, I mean, his idea of causality is we can't peer into nature. He's an empiricist, so causality is this constant conjunction. We just associate things, and so and so then he's going to argue that that any sort of design for the world, we don't have experience. We don't have experience of creators or designers at the level of the cosmos creating worlds, and so because we don't have any inductive experience there, we can't draw any conclusion. But Thomas Reid, and it's interesting because Hume wrote the dialogues, I think 1750s, 1760s, but he didn't publish it because he knew it would be too inflammatory. So he died 1776. It was published posthumously 1779. Well, Reid, I think it's 1780 or 81, I think it's 1780 that he does his lectures on natural theology, where he takes on Reid on that very point about induction. And I think it's brilliant, and for me it's a knockdown argument. And his point is that the induction to infer design can never even get off the ground. I mean, it's not just at the level of the cosmos, but anything, even in our immediate experience. This goes back to design inferences with humans. That's okay. Well, even on Hume's principles, it would not be okay, because how do you know, for instance, you look at something that's an arrowhead, how do you know that it's an arrowhead? Somebody was chipping away at it, an artisan. But was he chipping away intentionally, or was it just random? People whittle, doodle, do things, so how do we know the difference? And if we can't know the difference there, so the problem is that the induction keeps going back, and you never know unless you can actually, unless there's some sort of common sense or some way of knowing design as such, the induction to know design will never get off the ground, because you can always pose that question. Well, how do you know that this past experience of design is actually design and not just something that's random? So that's the argument there. And this, what you're referring to is in the book, The Design Inference, the second edition, there are these various excursus, these sections where I add things, and these typically they would have been long endnotes, but it seemed that I didn't want the endnotes often get lost in the reading, so I really wanted that to get in there. And so but I think that's really a crucial point. And so I was debating also with the epigraph for the book, because the epigraph in the first edition was from Abraham de Moivre about chance and design being in a fundamental competition. And he wrote this as he was looking at doctrines of chances and gambling scenarios. But there's also the quote by Thomas Reid from the Marks of Wisdom, in effect, a wise and intelligent cause can be inferred. And I think that to me also captures, if you will, the essence of the design inference. And then, it's taking Hume's, or not, taking Reid's common sense intuition and then giving it formal mathematical oomph. That's what the design inference does. So I see what I'm doing very much in continuity with Thomas Reid.
Yeah, I'm glad you didn't leave it in the end notes. I wouldn't have seen it otherwise.
Yeah.
So since you you referred to ignorance, the argument from ignorance that they claim against us. There's something I wanted to highlight. You refer to in the book where Richard Dawkins accuses Michael Behe of being lazy,
Right.
and that there's always Darwinian pathways which are unknown. So it's where they are claiming we are essentially arguing from ignorance, but at the same time, Richard Dawkins writes that we can't rely too much on sheer improbable luck. So there has to be some threshold that you cross, and after that, you can't rely on that luck anymore. But it seems he's saying two different things. There's the eternal door, which is open for the Darwinists, that there's always going to be a Darwinian pathway, and for them, as you point out, just merely hand waving towards a possible pathway is enough evidence for them. But at the same time, Richard Dawkins is admitting, as you point out, that there has to be a limit to the sheer improbable luck that Darwinists are relying upon.
Yeah. So how does he reconcile? Well, I think in a sense, the title of this one book that he did, Climbing Mount Improbable, that's his reconciliation. So at the end of the day, he may say that our scientific theories can only allow so much luck, but at the end of the day, he's going to say that but Darwinism doesn't require an inordinate amount of luck. And I think this is the great strength, supposedly, of natural selection for people like Dawkins, that it's a probability amplifier, that it can get you up Mount Improbable. If you have to scale Mount Improbable in one fell swoop, it's not going to happen. But if you can find a gradual serpentine path up where at each step things are reasonably probable. Yeah. I mean, there's always a problem, even if you have things that are in sequence, each reasonably probable, the entire sequence may be still vastly improbable, but but he's pushing a metaphor. He's not a mathematician, and that's but I think many people follow him on that natural selection can do all this heavy lifting, and because of that, something like Behe, who gives up on natural selection, this was Behe should get back in the lab and figure out how natural selection could produce an irreducibly complex system such as the bacterial flagellum. But this is always the challenge, right? When there are processes, and then you keep trying to make them work, and when they keep failing, then the question is, does the process, is it that we've just missed something, or are we fundamentally misguided about the nature of the process? And so I think Behe is giving up, as am I, but I think we're doing it not just for a record of failure to produce these systems, but also I think for good theoretical reasons. I mean, this irreducible complexity is a coherent, interesting notion. It's something that's exhibited, ascertainably so, in various biological systems, and it seems that systems like this, we do not have any clear, detailed Darwinian pathways to them. So that it seems it should be taken seriously as an obstacle. But the stricter Darwinists won't allow that.
Yeah, it's been 27 years since Behe's challenge, so there's plenty of time. And it's interesting that Dawkins would accuse Michael Behe of laziness. But he doesn't do that with Francis Crick. So when Crick is referring to directed panspermia as a possible solution to the origin of life, he's not. I mean, I see an inconsistency there, right? And this, in one part of your book, you write the point is that directed panspermia raises the prospect of a biological design inference in which biological systems exhibit actual rather than mere apparent design. So in a way, Crick has opened the door for us in a way that I don't think has been explored properly.
Yeah, well, I mean, he was certainly a brilliant thinker. He was an atheist, so he was not going to be going theistic route. But the thing is, when I first heard about panspermia and directed panspermia, I thought, oh, this is just utterly ridiculous. And I still think it's a problem. It kicks the can down the road, as we say. But he does admit that this is what it does, that it's an incomplete solution. but it's just the problem of life's origin on planet Earth is so great, that what if we allow ourselves, at least to get the ball rolling, and that this might be a valid way to, excuse me, to do so. So I think Crick was trying to be honest about it. I don't think he was just saying this is a solution that wraps everything up. It's just, it does defer the problem to other areas. But the fact that he was willing to consider directed panspermia. I mean, directed panspermia is not, panspermia is just, you've got meteors, and life forms by accident, hitch rides, and then move to other places. But directed panspermia is, intelligent aliens in spaceships are seeding Earth, and then possibly even designing these life forms. That's a design, and there's a design inference potentially that can be drawn there.
Yeah, absolutely. There's an interesting part in your book, which when I was making notes, I decided to refer to Christopher Hitchens' debate. So this is on page 353, what to make of bad design, right?
Yeah.
So we know this is one of the oldest sort of arguments that's actually made, and we can see here that the same thing that they're claiming against us, that we're arguing from ignorance, it's a very simple reply, that they're doing the same. So before we get into this, some discussion about what you've written here, during the debate, Hitchens was referring to bad design, and you were answering him on those particular points. Did you feel, I mean, when I was watching the debate, I felt there was a complete mismatch, because it felt like he hadn't read your stuff. He hadn't actually upgraded his knowledge from maybe what he'd heard 30 years ago. And, the arguments were just quite crude. And for someone like him, who's normally really quite well prepared, I felt he wasn't really giving it his best.
Yeah. Well, that may be. Now this debate, it's about 13 years ago. And so I'm going to need to rummage through my memory to to get to specifics there. But
you refer to the appendix, right, as an example.
Yeah. I mean, he was dying of 4-stage cancer at that point. So I think, I'm not sure if he was up on his game, although other times he would be drunk on stage. So that's
better.
So he wasn't always up on his game elsewhere. But Hitchens was a literary guy. And so it was just interesting. I read his book, God Is Not Great, carefully. And he does, in the book, rest heavily on Darwin and evolutionary theory to justify his atheism and move forward. So, but if we're going to talk bad design, I deal with it in that section on evolutionary biology. There are always things you can point to where you can imagine that there would be some improvement. And then you also have, there are just things like parasites and just nasty things in biology that if you're going to say, well, if they're designed, they seem to be designed really well to do nasty things to people and to other organisms. So I think all of that is there. I've always found bad design at that level is more of a theological argument. The question ultimately, the first question is, is there design at all? And then I think the way that debate tends to go more these days is, well, it's not that it's malevolent design, it's just incompetent design, it's bungling design, and therefore we should not think that there's even a designer there. But even that bad design in that sense, we have all sorts of examples of bad design that's still design in human context. So, but I think the way I approach it in the book is also to say, even if we allow that there could be, bungled design or whatnot, do we have any clear instances of really superlative design? And that's it seems to me that there are. So that's and you're going to have to deal with that. So for the Darwinist and materialist, what they have to their claim is that for every instance of biological complexity, it is not designed. Okay, yeah. So for every X, not this. Okay, the negation of that is going to be there exists some instance of clear design. Okay, I mean, it's just first order predicate logic. When you put a negation in front of a for all not, then it becomes there exists, yeah, such and such. And so all we need to do is actually establish one clear instance of design. And I think there's, so from a logical point of view. But the bad design argument gets a lot of mileage because, well, who's the designer? It's supposed to be a good God, at least for Christian theists. And then how do you account for the evil or the bad design? And, I think from Judeo-Christian perspective, there's a doctrine of the fall. And I think even within the Muslim perspective, I mean, the fall of Adam, in a sense, I think one account I've read is that Adam falls from heaven. So it's, and so I'm sorry if, my knowledge of Islam is not very extensive. I mean, I've read the Quran, but anyway, it's, so I think we're probably all three major theistic faiths would say, the God who created everything is good, but there's still problems in the world. This is not the new heaven and new earth where we're united with God.
Yeah, absolutely. And the simplest way to refute these sort of arguments is to go back to what you said initially, which is it's not even a biological question. We are now talking about theology. So what would a designer do? That's fine. We can have that discussion, but we are no longer speaking on in the realm of science. I think that's an important point to keep in mind. And also that when we look at, say, if a door is opened, rather than using a doorstop, someone uses a gift. Someone can turn around and say, well, isn't that dumb? You're using, rather than a doorstop, you're basically using an expensive gift to prop open a door. Well, if you look at the sum of purposes for the designer, the sum of purposes could be to open the door, but another purpose could be to simply surprise the person that's going to have the door propped open for them. So, if we look at designers not only have to look at purposes and then there's a summation of them which can lead to constraints, but there's also constraints from a biological perspective, which are there because we are, creatures of the earth, and they are going to be constraints. So, I just like to, refer people to exactly what you were saying. Even if you have this idea in your head, well, if I was God, I would have done this. It's irrelevant. It's totally and utterly irrelevant. One of the things which I think what I really like about the intelligent design movement is that they are willing to admit that the design inference is not enough to refer to the Abrahamic God or anything else.
Right.
It's just there to say that certain features of the biological world are best explained by intelligence as opposed to Darwinian processes. So we have less to defend. And what I find, Bill, regularly is that Darwinists and atheists are trying to drag us into a bigger battle, right? Something that we don't actually want to get involved in, but this is a perpetual problem. There's something else which is quite interesting. You've changed the explanatory filter, right?
Yeah.
And this I think for the audience, is going to come as a bit of a shock. In fact, it was the first thing I was looking for when I picked up the copy. But I was delighted to see you simplified it. So could you just go over what is the significance of the filter?
Yeah. Well, the filter is a user-friendly, rational reconstruction of how we draw the design inferences. So it's based on the full apparatus, and in the lead up, because this is I present it here we present it in a chapter of the design inference. That's so it, in a sense it encapsulates the design inference, everything we've talked about. Previously, though, I think what I tried to do with the original filter was to accommodate our natural intuitions, and there was I saw it more as a checklist, in the past. The first thing is, if you're looking at an ice crystal, for instance, an ice crystal is going to form by necessity. It's just, it's just the nature of the water. When it's frozen, it's going to form this hexagonal shape. So no design inference there. I mean, because it comes about by necessity. And then the next thing was contingency. Are there various ways it could happen? There would be a probabilistic calculation, and then also, is it specified? So there were these three things. It was a checklist. Yeah. And the problem was when you had necessity and chance, people who would look at this would say, well, you're putting these necessity, chance, and design all as mutually exclusive and exhaustive, which really wasn't being done, but I can see why there was some lack of clarity with that. But then also, chance often in people's minds is, pure randomness. And the Darwinists then would come back and say, well, it's not really it's not pure chance. It's a combination of chance and necessity. So you've got natural selection operating. And so it just seemed simpler just to say, look, chance can accommodate necessity, in the sense necessity is just chance when the probabilities all are 0 and 1. Okay. Yeah. And then chance can also accommodate this broad. Doesn't have to just be pure chance in this Dawkinsian sense, but it can be basically any sort of stochastic process. And so chance in this new improved explanatory filter encompasses necessity, encompasses chance, encompasses the combination of chance and necessity, and then design is the foil, is the contrast class to it. And so I think it's simpler, it's conceptually simpler. It's interesting, it ties right into that epigraph where Abraham de Moivre says, chance and design are in competition. And, so necessity becomes this kind of special case of chance where the probabilities collapse to 0 and 1. And so that's, everything that's in the old filter is there. Nothing is lost, but I think it's just conceptually cleaner. And so that's what that's the new improved filter.
Yeah. I mean, I was happy to see that you actually kept it and you made it simpler, because I think for these discussions can get quite technical, but if you are speaking to someone at a very basic level, you need something as simple as that you can refer to. So my second last question before we end is the challenge from evolutionary computing. So this is something that you've addressed in the book. Could you just go over how you've addressed that?
Yeah, I mean, the challenge of evolutionary computing is that you're supposed to be able to get things that are like Mike Behe's irreducibly complex systems. Basically in a computational setting, we can generate things that the design inference is going to say is designed. I would, when we've looked at these evolutionary computing programs, what we always find is that the design, as it were, gets snuck in. So it's not that you're getting design for nothing, and and so you're actually smuggling in the information that you're claiming to get out. So you can think of it this way. This was an example. I was interviewed years and years ago by Peter Robinson, and it was Eugenie Scott and I were being interviewed. Eugenie Scott at the time was the head of the National Center for Science Education, which was this big pro-evolution, anti-intelligent design group. And Peter Robinson raised the trope about monkeys typing Shakespeare, given enough time, given enough randomness over time, that they could do this. And she said, yeah, but that's not how natural selection works. The way natural selection works is you basically have the monkeys typing, but at the behind the monkey, there's a lab tech who's got a whole vat of whiteout. And whenever the monkey types something incorrect, the lab tech whites out the incorrect phrase or word or letter, and then we move on. And she left it at that, as though that explains the problem. But the issue is it's just moved the problem back. Okay, how did the lab tech know what the error was? I mean, the very concept of error presupposes a way that things are supposed to be. All our language about evil, in fact, and errors presupposes the right way. Sin in the Greek New Testament is hamartano, it's missing the mark. Well, there's got to be a mark. And so how did the lab tech know what to get rid of? And the whole point of this example is to explain Shakespeare without Shakespeare. And so that's what we always were finding in these evolutionary computing programs, that the information was being snuck in. And so that became more of an empirical result. I mean, you'd have, there was a program, Avita, that was being touted. It got play in the journal Nature back in 2003, and it was being used as a refutation, a confutation of Michael Behe's work.
Yeah.
And what you found, though, was that the sort of there was a stair-step function, and it was achieving what it was claiming to get for free by actually building that right into the program. So we kept finding this pattern. And then over time, when you keep seeing the same sort of thing happening, where they claim that they're getting this information for free, they're not, it leads to, you to ask, is there a general mathematical principle at stake here? And there is. It's something we call conservation of information. It's basically when you get information out, even of an evolutionary process, it's built into the process. It can be in the form of a fitness landscape or what have you, but the information was there. In fact, our notion of conservation of information, it keys off of these no free lunch theorems, but it's saying that the information conservation is the best you can do. So when you feed information, or when a system is outputting information, the amount of information that has to be fed into it is at least as much as what you're getting out. Yeah. But in fact, it can be a lot more. In fact, in a lot of contexts, it becomes exponentially more, because what you have is what you're doing is what we call a search for the search. You can imagine, for instance, you got a big island, you're looking for a treasure. The treasure is hidden someplace, highly improbable that you're, by some sort of random search, going to find it. So what do? You go to Rand McNally map store, and you find all the maps, various maps of the island. And then there's one that's got an X, which marks where that treasure is. Yeah. But how did you get the map with that X? There are lots of other maps there could be. So what you've done is now it's the search for the search. You're searching for a map, which will then allow you successfully to search for the treasure. And that's what we always find. There was this backtracking problem, and the information, if anything, the information problem was exacerbated, it got worse. At best, you could maintain parity. So it's not conservation of information is not like conservation of energy, where the energy stays rigidly constant. It's just that as you backtrack causally with information, the information problem either stays constant or it gets worse. And so these are well-established mathematical theorems, actually. I mean, we've proven them. Winston Ewarts, Bob Marks at Baylor, and I have done that. And this is in standard IEEE literature, engineering literature. And that's actually the topic of a succeeding book. We're actually going to include conservation of information in the design inference too. But as you can see, I mean, it's almost 600 pages. So that was, and this requires actually a book of its own now.
Yeah. And also in your book, you refer to how this would be for us, what physicists have in terms of the laws of thermodynamics, the second law, as in a way of, I forgot how you worded it exactly, but you said it completes the design inference, right? Having the law of conservation.
Yeah, I mean, I could speak to that just briefly. I mean, I think what I think what we can do is we can apply this design inferential methods to something like a Michael Behe irreducibly complex system, and I think there's good reason. We can run the numbers, at least for certain systems, and say, okay, there's a design inference that holds. But the Darwinist then can also say, well, but let's say that there's a Darwinian process that produces it. Then we can say, okay, well, what what is it about that process? How did you get this process in the first place that allows you to generate something like an irreducibly complex system? So there's the design inference and conservation of information. Design inference would say we can run the numbers, highly improbable, specified, therefore designed. If they say no, we're not going to, we don't think you've adequately established that. Okay, then how do you get a system that produces things that seem designed? And so there's a design that has to be built into the evolutionary process, and we can look at that. So in a sense, the design inference is looking at design in the things. Conservation of information is looking at design in the process. Processes can be designed also. And if processes are giving you things that are designed, there's good reason to think that those processes are designed. So that's, I was stumbling a little bit to express it that way, but that's the distinction.
Brilliant explanation. So my last question as we're coming to the hour mark is, what would you like future ID theorists to focus on? What areas of research would you recommend?
Yeah, I think keep doing what we're doing. I think, we need to keep looking at biological systems. The thing with biological systems is that they are difficult. I mean, it's not like flipping coins. As a probabilist, I'm often looking at very stylized types of examples where you've got probabilistic processes that we can get a good handle on. So I think continue examining these systems. And if anything, since I've got into this 30 plus years ago, the problems have been getting worse. I mean, I detail some of this in the book, where you've got, data information density within, the DNA. I mean, even 15 years ago, people were talking about junk DNA, that the vast majority of our DNA was non-functional. Well, now nobody's making that argument anymore. It's all functional now. But, it's not just that it's functional, but that it can be like a crossword puzzle where you've got multiple levels of information. So a crossword puzzle, if you think of it like 5 by 5 square, you might say you've got, let's say, and you're filling it up with bits, it's, 25 bits of information. But if you can read it horizontally and vertically, now you've doubled the information density. And it seems that we're finding this with various reading frames and reverse palindromes. So I think, the biological world, it's a marvel what God has created. I think, and if anything, we're going to be finding more and more design and levels of design and intricacies, and we're going to be getting inspiration for our engineering designs from this. And I think we just need to be open to the magnificence of what God has created and what we can learn from that. And I think a design theoretic perspective gives us a much better way to be learning and growing in our biological inquiries than a Darwinian perspective, which is basically a cookie cutter approach. I mean, there are various mechanisms. I mean, natural selection still seems to be the dominant one. You can add symbiogenesis and, neutral evolution and Evo, Devo, and whatnot. But at the end of the day, you have these mechanisms that are going to be doing the same sort of thing over and over. And then how do you explain the tremendous diversity and complexity and and brilliance that we see in life? And this is actually an interesting thing that I also document in the book. It's I think, and it's in response to the design theorists that they now have to poo-poo the design that they find in life, and try to make it seem inferior, and speak of it as over-engineered and kludgy and whatnot, But these are just adjectives, They're, look at the systems yourself and see what they're doing. I mean, when you have a bacterial flagellum that its proton-powered motor is operating at almost 100% efficiency, where we don't have anything like that with our motors, you got to ask yourself, there's something marvelous going on there.
Yeah. And ultimately, design as a research heuristic is there. Yeah. Francis Crick, Dawkins, they all speak about, whatever you see, you have to constantly remind yourself that it wasn't designed, it evolved. And design is a working tool as an assumption, as a, you simply can't escape it. So, even if we try and, make biology as naturalistic as possible, you will always refer to design. And then the ultimate question is, how can you tell the difference between God's design and natural selection's design if they are both, there, present? Because, you have constraints, you have purposes, you have these types of things. So, I mean, there's a lot of, I haven't seen you write too much about the theological aspect. You focus mostly on, just grounding it from a philosophical perspective. But I'd like to see that as well. It'd be good to see your insights in some of those theological areas. So thank you so much, Bill.
Thank you.
For your time. And I hope to have you back when you have your new book out on the conservation of information. I think that's going to be a big game changer as well. Where can people follow you if they want to keep up to date? Are you on X, Twitter, Instagram?
I'm on X, but I hardly ever post. I tend to go with long form content. So I have a blog, BillDembski.com, and I really need to post more regularly there. So that's, and then there's Discovery Institute. They have an evolution news forum, so they'll sometimes reprint some things about me. And so those probably are the two best places. But BillDembski.com, especially if people want to reach me, there's a contact page. So that's where I would send people.
Brilliant. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for your time.
Likewise. All the best. Thank you. Bye.